Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Danny Haig, filling in today for our usual MC, Lynn Weil. Today, we'll discuss how to best evaluate a diverse range of AI systems and build trust among stakeholders across a variety of sectors and applications. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator, John Bansemer, a senior fellow and director of the CyberAI project at CSET. In addition to his work at CSET, he is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Prior to joining CSET, John served in a variety of cyber, space, and intelligence positions within the US Air Force before retiring as a lieutenant general. His last role was serving as the Assistant Director for National Intelligence, Partner Engagement within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Chief Central Security Service at the National Security Agency and a variety of staff positions, including on the Air Staff and the National Security Council. His joint experience includes serving as the Director of Intelligence at European Command. John holds a master's degree in computer science from James Madison University, was a National Defense Fellow at Harvard University, and received his BS in computer science and statistics from Roanoke College. John, over to you.
Thanks so much, Danny. I appreciate it. And I'm really excited to be part of this webinar. And I'd like to just start by introducing our speaker today, Dr. Heather Frase. Heather leads our AI assessment line of research at CSET. Prior to joining CSET, Heather spent 8 years providing data analytics, computational modeling, and AI ML support for warfighters. Additionally, Heather spent many years at the Institute for Defense Analysis, supporting the Director of Operational Tests and Evaluation. At IDA, she led analytic research teams to develop data metrics and collection plans for operational tests of major defense systems, analyze test data, and produce assessments of operational effectiveness and suitability. She has a PhD in material science from the California Institute of Technology and a BS in physics from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I can think of no better person to talk about today's subject. So without further ado, over to you, Heather. Thanks.
So once again, thank you for joining me. I want to talk a little bit about my line of research, but also some about what is informing it and how really there's no simple solution, no one-size-fits-all solution to how we assess AI and how we build trust across a diverse range of systems. So first, way at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. I want to start by explaining how we have in our society, for various things, not just AI, built these structures of trust so that we can trust systems, and how that kind of informs how I approach my research and where I focus. But first, let's just talk about a little bit about what is trust. So there's a lot of discussion in AI community about different terms associated with trust, safety, responsible AI, trustworthiness, explainability, interpretability. There's a lot of terms going around, and I really don't want to go down that rabbit hole into terminology, but I do want to talk kind of about how I'm framing trust for this specific presentation, just to help people follow it and understand better. So when there is trust, what we have is we tend to have communication and transparency between the entities involved, the people, the organizations, and that allows for understanding. And that allows the people involved, entities involved, to feel safe from harm and to believe they will not be intentionally hurt. And also to have confidence that when mistakes are made, they will be acknowledged and rectified, and to expect to avoid repeating mistakes, right? If someone makes a mistake, that's one thing, but to do it over and over without trying to change the process, we know there's a problem. And these are things like we look for and how we have trust in a friendship, but we can also have trust in competitors or adversaries through contracts or through treaties. You know, they establish an understanding of how we're going to interact together and what things we're going to avoid doing to hurt each other, and also what are the consequences if we violate that contract or treaty. But inherent to trust, there is still a remaining element of uncertainty and risk, and there is going to be change in the relationship that has trust. It's not stable, and there's always a chance of harm. I trust, a friend, but there's still a risk they can harm me. And you can also trust inanimate objects. I trust the chair I'm sitting on, but there is still a chance it will break and I'll fall on my rear end, which it has happened. But, things like the sun, I know there's a chance the sun could go away, but not in my lifetime. I really don't need to have trust that the sun will come up every morning. I just know it will, because there's no risk. And there's no uncertainty, and there's no change in my relationship with the sun. Therefore, there's really no element of trust. Now, we socially and as a culture tend to build these kind of like abstract trust structures to help us have trust in different products. We tend to make trusted companies is what we try to develop that produce the trusted products. But they do this using some communal resources, things available to everyone and all the companies. Similarly, we also look and identify trusted users. Now that's different than the user trusting the product. It's the product and the system trusting the user, because we want to find, and we tend to look and identify those untrusted users, deny them access to the products or the trusted system, but also look at the trusted users and maybe decide if there's different levels of trust. Maybe we don't let them access to all products, just some of them, because of the user's level of trust. And now I'm going to go through some examples of this. So you can see that it's pretty common. This structure is around, and it's something that we can use for looking at AI. Semiconductors are things that we trust. We have actually foundational research to understand how to make safe semiconductors that are reliable, and safety research, because actually in the US, we've recognized that we shouldn't just take semiconductor products from everywhere, or some of them are safer than others. Some of them may contain malicious code or unsafe security issues. So we have processes that we've figured out are issues, and we have trusted companies then we know that use these processes so that they can have trusted semiconductor products. We also have identified people that we don't want to allow access to our trusted semiconductor system. And we also, some organizations trust certain products more than others. So they may tell their users, you can't use product A, or you can use product B, but only with the system or in these conditions. So we once again kind of like regulate the conditions and the user's access to certain products. Now, using roads for public, private transportation and public transportation, that's something most of us have experience with. This is a good example where we don't let everyone access, right? Some people aren't licensed. You don't let kids drive cars. They're not licensed to do so. Similarly, not everyone has the same licensing, right? A semi-automatic trailer, not everyone can drive one of those. You have to have a specific license and training and demonstration, and then you're given access. So we have different level of accesses to different products in this condition too. We have our communal resources, which tend to be safety research, which have supported improvements in products like seat belts, baby seats, things like that help make better, safe products for transportation. We have communal resources like roads are public resources, and we have snow plows and maintenance crews that come along and keep the things safe for us and when needed. Then we have identified trusted producers, both of the cars and of the infrastructures, things like the roads, that we know they're going to follow requirements and regulations and guidelines and best practices so that the whole thing is safe, and we're able now to use our trusted products to move around on roads safely. Now, one thing to notice or to note is that systems can change and evolve. So we have now driving cars, and we're trying to figure out how we put them into our trusted road transportation system safely. All right, now I'm going to look at banks. So I know we've had a couple of very prominent bank closing, but I think you can very strongly argue that our banking system is still trusted despite that, because not everyone's pulled their money out of all the other banks. We still have banks being used today, and people feel comfortable with their current personal bank. So we have like rules and regulations and processes that we can use to identify safe, reliable, trusted banks. Similarly, those banks have a whole bunch of different trusted financial products that users can use, and they're built on a foundation of communal resources, the US dollar being the big one, but there's also the Federal Reserve and standards for how to transfer money back and forth. Those are just some of the many communal resources. Again, we've identified untrusted users that aren't allowed to use the banks. And also the banking system, they have know your customer processes and customer risk assessment processes. And that allows them to basically assign risks to different customers, and they may not let every customer have access to every financial instrument. Some customers may only be allowed to have banking accounts. Others may be allowed to have loans, things like that. Now, once again, things change. Life, new products come available, things have to get modified, and you have to modify your system as new things like cryptocurrencies come on the market. The other thing to note is that there are banking systems outside of our trusted structure. There are ways for people to bank not in the normal US sanctioned banks, even though they're doing transactions in the US. Some of these underground banking systems, they may be fine and trusted users can use them without worry. Others are untrustworthy banking system, unofficial banks. And both these banks that are unofficial can be leveraged for abuse by bad actors. So here we see kind of like where we want to go and eventually be with an AI kind of nice support structure of trust. We have, orgs following best practices, producing trustworthy AI based on research that helps us understand what's good AI, how to produce good and safe AI. We can identify bad actors and prevent them from misusing the systems and the product. And we also can understand the trustworthy risk levels of the other users and what things they should or should not have access to. But I would say this is more where we are. On the good point, we do have some structure starting, but we still have a ways to go to build a nice sturdy structure. Now, here are some of the problems, the issues and the needs that I see currently. This is not exhaustive, okay? This is really a reflection of my interests and like where I want to look for research, but it's once again, it's not exhaustive. There are other things here. Some of the things we're missing for communal resources are that we have a lot of capability gaps for understanding and maintaining and developing trust and for all AI products. We lack a real good understanding of how these systems behave differently when they're into production, when they're deployed in real operating conditions versus how they behave in development or in the testing before deployment. We also don't really have a good understanding or thorough understanding of all the ways AI could be misused or abused. As far as trusted companies go, I think we've actually are making quite a bit of progress in establishing best practices, but they're not covering every company or every condition, and there's inconsistent adoption. And I also think sometimes they're a little unclear and complicated, which makes them hard to be adopted. Now, for trusted products, We have some AIs more trustworthy than others, but it's hard to tell which of those are which. It can be challenging to assess the trust of individuals or specific AI. And it can also be hard to know even if you're dealing with AI systems sometimes. For trusted users, can't always identify or restrict the malicious users, the bad actors, and it's hard to prevent misuse, intentional misuse of AI systems. And there's a limited understanding of how we can maybe do different access controls. I want to point out that we need the whole structure. So you can't just focus on one thing as a community. Yes, you really need to, we need to work on all of these items in order to have a system of trust for AI. And these items basically, because they feed into each other. You can't have a strong structure if you have a weak roof or a weak foundation or weak walls. They are interdependent. A lot of your communal resources, they're going to affect how you can assess the trustworthiness of products or how you're going to be able to identify trusted users and prevent misuse. I'd also like to point out, like we saw with the banking systems, it is easy with AI to have systems that are going to fall outside of the structure. And that is because the user of the AI can also be the producer. Fundamentally, AI is just math. So that means anyone that's willing to put in the effort can make an untrustworthy AI or an AI that they intend to use for harm. Now, some of these user producer AI, outside of the kind of trust structure are not going to be harmful and may be trustworthy, but they're going to be outside the structure and it's going to be hard to know. So I've kind of talked about that basic building structure analogy for trust and trusted systems, but really it's still a level more complicated than that. And I'm going to go back to the banking system because, really, we have more than banks as part of our financial system in the US. The banks, they're just one component. There are a whole bunch of wide range of financial institutions, each which need their own little structure of trust. And then we have to interconnect them together to build this larger structure so that we can function and have our economy running. And once again, there's still lots of products out there that will fall outside this structure because there's limits to what you can keep, what you can assure is inside your trust, because there are underground systems. So I really see that eventually we're going to need to move to this more interconnected, multi-structure, complex view or for having trustworthy AI across all types of AI. And that's just because there's too much diversity in AI. I do see hope, though, that we can at some point maybe put a little trust structure over some of these, outside of the system user-produced AI products and have some trust in them and bring them in tangentially. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about my actual research now, and what I'm doing here at CSET. So we can see that it's really informed by my view of this overall structure, how we're going to need to build structure of trust with nice strong foundation, trusted products, and trusted organizations, but it's going to be complex. These different types and, with the AI with a wide range of functions and capabilities and applications and data types, they're going to need their own little buildings probably that are connected together. Additionally, we know they're going to be, well, we don't know, but we expect and project that there's going to be new AI that we don't really know about yet, new innovations. They're going to require modifications to whatever we come up with, and potentially their own new little building structures of trust. So my personal research, I deal with assessing AI. I'm leading the AI assessment line of research at CSET. So that is what I'm focused on. And I'm focused a large part too on what communal resources do we need to make a better foundation? And what can we do to make better trusted companies? I am not building any AI myself, not dealing with the walls, right? So here are my long-term overall research goals. And I think if you look in your upper right-hand corner, that's my little mini guide to if I'm dealing with the trusted companies, the blue pointed roof, or a foundational type of research, which is sort of like the beige flat structure. So the kind of things that are in the communal resources, the foundational beige structure, those I'm looking at tools and resources, what's out there for the wide variety of AI products and tools that we need for assessment, kind of what do we have? Also, where are the gaps? So once I know what we have, it's easier to assess then what we need. Where do we need to add infrastructure? Where do we need more research, more tools? The other parts are looking at the trusted companies. Those deal with understanding and contributing to development of best practices. And that's sort of my develop and adopt goal. Then finally, it's compare. What are the global differences and similarity in AI assessment standards, practices among sectors and governments? So those are the goals. And then here are the active research I have going on to support these goals right now. I have some work on regulations, looking at how compliance professionals view regulations, work on standards creations, looking at how other sectors, not AI, but other sectors have gone through what they have experienced, what was their process for developing standards, and what lessons learned can we extract from that. Also have a large amount of work on AI incidences. What can we understand about misuse, abuse, or harm from AI systems? Of creating a taxonomy so that you can understand and characterize harm and make it ready for analytics, defining harm, developing a way for extracting characteristics of harm out of actual instances so that trends can be identified. I have work on characterizing and improving the assessment processes so that we can have a clearer and more complete understanding of how companies can implement best practices. I am also looking at open source code. So that is a very important communal resource. As a coder, you, whenever possible, tend to just go and look at what other people have already done when you need a task. Look at what they've done, leverage it, use it as is as they've already done it, or maybe leverage it and modify it. So what open source code is out there for assessment and for understanding AI quality or AI trust is very important, because without those resources, things are going to be hard to implement as far as AI assessment goes. And then also, that's sort of like for the coder level person, but not everyone's going to do their own AI assessments, using, developing the tools themselves. Some people are going to need help. They're going to need resources that are like off the shelf, designed for retail, for the consumer. So what software or platforms are out there to help people very easily do AI assessment in a way that ensures or promotes trust? And again, I want to thank you guys for coming and listening. AI assessment, AI trust and safety, something I have been very concerned about for a number of years. I'm really happy to see that it's growing in interest, and I look forward to discussing things with you.
Thanks so much, Heather. I appreciate it. I'm gonna let your slides go down so everybody can see you. That's awesome. And just for everyone that's still on the webinar, the chat is now open, so please start placing your questions into the chat. As you do that, I'm going to kind of take moderator's privilege to kind of ask the first question. And Heather, you did a great job of kind of laying out this whole concept of trust. And clearly, if AI is going to be as effective as we all want, users are going to have to trust this system. And I think your role assessment really kind of helps in terms of kind of bolstering trust in these systems. And so my question for you is, particularly given your background, right? DoD has had for a long time a pretty rigorous test evaluation, validation, and verification process that they've had in place for traditional systems. Are those and other processes like those appropriate for AI? Or maybe a different way to kind of think about this is, what makes AI different than other non-AI systems when it comes to assessment?
So I actually think AI is more different. AI assessment is more different from traditional software assessment than it is from when I worked on assessing radars. And I think that's maybe the big jump, is that somewhere we want to do things like A/B testing or bug finding and just simple flowcharts with AI to make sure things are working out as expected. And that's not the way it's going to go. Defense testing is actually more focused on knowing that there's going to be discovery in your system, trying to do that discovery as soon as possible, and then just demonstrating effectiveness and safety and suitability and security at the end. So I would say the big thing they need to do is actually stop thinking like software testing, think more of like other sort of traditional testing sciences approach. And the other key is to start thinking of testing sooner. A lot of times they just see testing at the end. Really, a good solid test program pulls it forward. The other thing I think that's really strong about Defense Department testing is there's not one testing program. There's maybe like 20, right? It all depends upon the complexity of your system, the type of your system, and the impact. So you're not going to have like one testing process for everything. And neither, there's going to be a big difference of testing a small language model and a large language model, and focusing on that too.
Gotcha. Kind of the title of your talk today, right? One size doesn't fit all. All right, well, the questions are coming in, so I don't want to take up other time because I know that there are other voices that are out there. And one of the questions that was raised was kind of pointing out the fact that we've had all of this great AI innovation for many years, and particularly in the last several years. And much of that has been done without much regulation of the industry. And even when you do have regulations, that doesn't necessarily, for example, prevent bad behavior. Yeah. So with that in mind, who should be deciding what is trustworthy versus harmful in your regard, and how should we navigate this process as we move forward?
Oh, so the who. I think, I'm going to lean back on the DoD experience. It depends upon how much impact it's going to have and the potential for harm. But that being said, so I think there is a need for an oversight role, and that may be auditors, that may be the government. There's a variety of oversight roles, but the thing about oversight is they have independence. But you can't do oversight of everything. That's non-practical. There's not the resources for that, basically. The other thing comes back to, there are going to be, once again, users can be the producer. So if you're the user and the producer, you yourself are going to have some responsibility. Yeah. I think John's a cyber person. And so he likes to point out that we've just now gotten into the realm where we're realizing that we've had to also shift a lot of the responsibility for cybersecurity to the developer. And that's because there's a limit to what the user can do. So that is also important, right? I as an individual cannot be responsible for the trust of every AI system I use, right? I have to rely on the developer, and I have to rely on others with that expertise. Well, I guess in this case, well, even I couldn't do every AI, right? But you, as an individual, you have to rely on other people to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do find, you mentioned it, so why not bring it up, right? So I found it really interesting. And the Office of the National Cyber Director kind of just recently issued their national cybersecurity strategy. And they have taken a fundamentally different view of what has kind of existed in cybersecurity for a long, long time, right? And that view is that the developers and vendors have an obligation to take what they call reasonable precautions to secure their software, instead of kind of relying on the end user to always be responsible for the security of systems, or kind of a buyer takes ware approach. So I do see some analogs in that approach as we move forward. One of the other go ahead.
I would go back to my
sure.
beginning slide too, right? If we have trust, we assume that harms will not be repeated over and over and over without some correction. Yeah. So there's never an as is, we're done, I think, with the AI, or at least not with most AI systems. There's some responsibility. If there's a repeated and identified harm, it needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You didn't even know that this was a question, but you kind of answered it, right? Which is, why not let the marketplace decide for itself, right? In what you just described is that we can't, if we're having repeated harms, then there may need to be some type of intervention in some instances.
Yeah, especially the problem can be is that the person harmed is not the user, right? Right. I think that's why a lot of people are highlighting the HR related AI system, the human resources related AI systems, because those users are not the people being harmed by the systems. And so, they're not feeling the consequence. And that's why you can need outside protections and not just the market making determinations.
A lot of the people on the chat are kind of noting the challenge of that is assessment in AI, right? It's a big space to cover. And one of the questions is where could we get the most bang for the buck in the immediate term in addressing the kind of current gaps that we may have in either kind of building trust in AI, or at least as part of the assessment?
So I think there's two parts. I think there's some very common, or I think most of our AI out there is actually fairly simple. There's simple machine learning, used to predict maintenance times, or used to decide where we're going to water a field for agriculture. Those can be fairly straightforward. I think those are ones where we could build our little structure and have a pretty sound one quite quickly. But there's others, generative models, where I don't know we have enough research to understand how to make them trustworthy and how to prevent them from misuse. And I feel very confident we don't know all the ways they can cause harm right now. Those, though, we don't want to let go maybe willy-nilly. We need to start talking about how we can do some at least basic intermediate things to help us. And I would say, some simple ones that don't require, heavy-handed regulation, or the regulation is an option, are just at least collecting information about the types of harms these things do. So I almost think of that, instead of maybe for generative AI, building that nice structure right now, we're just sort of making a temporary shelter, right? Something to keep us at least the basics and a nice little bit amount of safety while we start building the bigger thing.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And one of the worries that I think that we're seeing as AI becomes more prominent is, for example, with leakage and data, right? So these systems are built on large data sets, and they may even have access to user data as well. And so there's a variety of different examples that have already kind of become publicized about how do we protect user data. Now, I know this isn't necessarily a data privacy webinar, but I mean, it does seem to me that this is part of an overall assessment process in terms of making sure that the system is safe and reliable. So do you have any thoughts on that aspect of it?
So I am not a data privacy expert, but I would say that this is like when I talk about with planning, testing way ahead, is that you need, if you're going to have data where you need to make an risk assessment to see if you have a system where privacy is an issue, you need to bring your experts in data privacy and AI governance and testing. You need to start talking to them early, because you might need to build your AI in such a way that those issues are less, right? You know, we still kind of tend to be running a lot under the idea of we build the AI and then we address all these issues, and then we do testing, and then we make sure it's safe. You know, some systems are inherently safer. So if you are building an AI for a problem and you potentially are choosing more than one approach, it's good to bring those experts in early to help you choose your path forward.
Yeah, so a lot of this, I think, is kind of these early interventions and really kind of doing a lot of the planning ahead of time before you start down this process, understanding how models could potentially leak data and all of those other aspects that can be extraordinarily challenging in this regard. So let's switch gears and talk about this through kind of a human lens, right? And a really interesting question that was posed is, are there lessons for creating trust in AI, i.e. trustworthy AI, from research on how humans learn to trust one another? So kind of the human level trust, but I'll add an extra layer to that as well, okay? So there's also an element of how humans learn to trust autonomous systems, right? So I think there's interesting cases in aviation, for example, where we now see that pilots have a pretty good trust of many of the autonomous systems that are available there. And so whether you want to take this through the lens of how humans trust other humans or how we learn to start to trust autonomous systems, I'm curious as to your thoughts on that area of question.
So I think that comes back to sort of at the beginning, where it's understanding how the system will behave, having enough insight so that you understand there's some level of communication, right? So that you can figure out what's going on. But it also needs to be kind of like high level enough to be understandable. A lot of times people want to explain the systems of AIs by throwing a lot of technical stuff at you. But you know, that's not really what you care about. You care about it's, you know, how is it going to behave? What issues do I need to worry about? When do I need to be concerned? But like, most of us don't know how our computers work, or really, apart from a very basic level, how the internet works, but we've kind of learned when there are issues in how it behaves. When do I need to go down and reboot my router? When do I actually just need to reboot my computer? When is it not me? So part of it's going to be familiarity, but part of it's going to be having a, you know, basic understanding and a flee for an information and figuring out what's the useful information for understanding a system so you can build trust. Yeah.
Okay, that totally get that piece. And one could argue that we may even be holding these systems to a higher standard than we do humans, right? Humans are fallible as well. We make mistakes. In autonomous vehicles, certainly when an autonomous vehicle makes a mistake, some of these tragic, we rightfully look at how how they failed and hold them to a pretty high standard. Do you think that we should be holding these types of systems to a higher standard than humans, or how do you kind of balance that kind of expectation for AI systems?
So that's an interesting philosophical question. I won't claim to have an answer. I do have some observations. I will say that once again, we may be holding AI to that higher standards because we know when humans are going to fail. We kind of understand the situations, the risk. We AI is failing in weird ways. So that's kind of why we want to clamp down and hold it to a higher standard, I think, as humans. The other thing is like, my team, which I have working on defining and looking at AI harm, we have lots of discussions about what's the difference between a failure and a harm, because we assume a car, we all know that, there's a chance our tire is going to blow, but we don't call it a harm. We call it a failure because it's manufactured to, only work so much. And with a certain probability of failure after wear, we don't really have that kind of counterpart for AI, right? So that's a kind of a philosophical question that I haven't answered.
Yeah, but without a doubt, and it's not something that we're going to solve in a 1 hour webinar for sure. But let's switch gears to we're also getting kind of questions on kind of the specifics, right? Which is, for example, the use cases that present the greatest risk or are kind of the easiest to attack. Do you see specific use cases that kind of concern you? One of the things that I think about when I hear questions like this is kind of how the EU has kind of started to look at AI systems and categorize it into kind of different kind of levels of risk. Have you or your team started thinking through systems that might require either greater levels of assessment or more rigor as they're deployed?
So I definitely think systems that have a big impact on someone's health, risk of death, or ability to earn income are huge, or risk of imprisonment, right? Those are ones I'm really concerned about. And that's kind of like where the EU's leaning and how they approach things. But I will say I'm also concerned that we kind of forget some of these smaller systems that could still have a really big impact on us. AI that maybe controls, once again, agricultural watering or crop rotations. If AI that affects our food supply, that's a big deal. But you don't necessarily think of it as high risk. I still think that's important to make sure it's working right, because we do need to feed everyone. We do need AI associated logistics to get things around well and not create problems, because we've seen how impact of logistics on the quality of life, recently with the pandemic. So I think while I agree there's some very obvious severe harms out there and use cases that are very concerning, because we haven't thought through the ramifications for all the risks of AIs, I don't want to think that if we just focus on those severe cases that we're minimizing our risk, because I think there's a lot of surprises we could get from the small or medium kind of sized AI.
Totally makes sense, and it shows kind of the complexity of the environment that we're operating in, right? And a kind of a related question is, these systems are making decisions in these kind of highly dynamic and ever-changing environments. And so the question then becomes, can assessments just be a stage rather than a kind of core and continual element of its deployment? The framing of this was, is it a gate or is it a guide? Is it something that you have to get past, or is it a guide that kind of follows through the life cycle of this AI system?
So I think it's being pretty much accepted by the community that it is like a continual process. I think the big thing I'm pushing for is recognizing that continuum starts earlier than most of us are thinking about. But even with your simple systems that like don't do continuous learning or don't do any sort of regular updating, you still need, even at the bare minimum, to monitor them and test when they're no longer good, right? So there's always going to need to be some sort of level of assessment or testing post deployment. And then if you're continuous learning, or that's even more important that you do that and continue going forward.
So let me pull on this strand of continuous learning, right? So these systems, they're data heavy, right? They're going to be pulling more data in. They're trying to make sure that they're ready for any type of distribution shift in the kind of data that they were trained on. So as that updating process occurs, how would a developer know when is the time to kind of redo an assessment? Is that part of every kind of new training cycle, or is there some other way that a developer can kind of say, yes, this is time, it is time now for more assessment?
So I will say that I'm hearing a variety of approaches, and I think we're still coming up with more things that will help with that. That's part of that foundational work. The simplest method is noticing that you're suddenly way out of the conditions you used to test with or used to develop on. So therefore you need to make a new test. I've heard, so that's sort of looking at looking at changes of the input or output data. I've heard about doing benchmarking against not other systems like we kind of hear about a lot of times, but against the deployed system to see when its performance has shifted. Then there are also approaches where you actually deploy for a certain set of operational conditions, a domain. And then as long as you operate in that domain, you're good. You go outside that domain, you have to go back through the testing process. So I think that's also, again, one of those things you need to plan ahead of time if you can, or at least have an idea for the multiple approaches you might take. But it's also a place where I'd like to see more research.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you another tricky question, right? None of these are easy. And the more
you're supposed to make me look good.
Well, it's more a matter of just how challenging this space is, right? And it really is something to the complexity that I see as AI develops is one that makes what you're trying to do, kind of understanding the assessment landscape, a really challenging one. And an example of that is there's been recent calls on moratoriums for the development of certain types of AI systems. And I'm not asking you to comment on that, but do you see either a future or a kind of a near future where instead of doing assessments, we need to kind of stop development at a particular stage, do further research in those types of aspects, more assessment, before development continues? I'm just curious as to how you would even know, right, that we've reached that stage where we should stop development on maybe a particular type of system.
So I think for me, I mean, that's an interesting question, but I almost feel like it's moot, because back to AI is just math, right? I guess you can restrict compute power, but I also have a background in financial crime. And so I know that, transnational organizations, bad guys, anyone who wants to do something bad will develop their own tools, right? We have ransomware out there developed on the dark and, developed independently, circulated and purchased through the dark web. So saying let's pause, I'm like, I kind of philosophically say I don't think people will.
The challenge, right, is these systems have diffused so quickly, right? The knowledge is built on an open source model and those types of pieces, and all of this makes it really hard, as you just described, right? So it's a classic proliferation problem in that regard.
So I almost rather have trusted producers, or at least people who have the intent of being trusted, doing research and feeding me information so that I know better how to protect against things. Those underground. So it's also not coincidence that I talked about the financial system, right? Because I have familiarity with it. The underground financial systems, the banks, they worry me because that's where bad things happen that I don't have insight into, that we as a culture don't have insight into. So trying to stop everything cold, I think just won't work. That doesn't mean we allow everything to happen, that we have to be some things that we decide as society we don't find acceptable. But that's kind of different than expecting a halt to some future.
Understand. So a different question, and probably more discreet and more accessible in one way at least, is what is the role for the users in all of this? Do we have a responsibility, or do we have a role in this in terms of trying to make these systems more trustworthy, more effective in the future? So what's the role? Or are we just passive agents? We just receive these systems. What's your thoughts on the role of the user?
I think the users can do a lot. First of all, like I talk about how we don't necessarily know all the ways these things could be misused and abused, right? And I think the users can contribute to that information, which helps feed into better AI. We have the equivalent of white hats, right? I go on YouTube and I watch all the fun videos about, jailbreaking or how to get ChatGPT to do some interesting things. Some of the things I'd rather ChatGPT didn't do, but at least we're finding out about them, and that feeds in information as opposed to people just hoarding that information and being able to use it for harm. Additionally, I think being aware of what these things can do and raising our level of awareness. But I think I agree with you, John, that there's still, the developer should have more responsibility than the user. The user can help. They can do some things to help that, communal understanding and resources. They can help identify, maybe non-trustworthy products or non-trustworthy companies, but I don't know that that should be their responsibility. Yeah.
I really like this example though of how users are really able to kind of understand, right? It's again, it goes back to kind of lessons we've learned in cyber, right? We can do a lot of beta testing and beta testing before a product is released, but leave it to the users to find the underlying vulnerabilities in those systems, and they will, right? And so it does seem like there may be a role for kind of this white hat kind of understanding and kind of looking for kind of the challenges that these systems may present. Going back to the regulator front, do you see a role? To me, it seems difficult for regulators, some of the traditional regulators, to necessarily have all of the expertise in AI testing, evaluation, and those types of things. So is there a role for independent auditing and those types of pieces, maybe for some of those more consequential systems that you talked about before? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think there is. And once again, I'm going to go back to my financial anti-money laundering background. The banking industry, they've been using some, what we consider relatively simple machine learning and maybe now not so simple machine learning processes for identifying fraud transactions, for doing customer risk assessments. Those things, they are regulated because banks are regulated. Those processes are regulated, but they, so you do have to rely on independent auditing for those systems though, and you are going to need some expertise. Additionally, I do believe that there's a key function to being independent, right? When I did testing for Department of Defense, I was in an independent oversight function. I did not receive money from any of the branches of the military, none of that for my testing. It was so that I could, tell people their baby was ugly if I had to tell people their baby was ugly. Yeah.
We're nearing the end of our time. I want to just try and maybe get 2 questions, and so we'll go pretty quickly through those. And but thanks again for a really fascinating conversation. But the first one is the kind of concern that I've heard raised in other pieces too, which is either excessive regulation, kind of this rigorous assessment process could cause us to lose a competitive edge, right? And this framed not only kind of in national security competition. So is there a concern that you see that by doing these extra layers, building trust in the system, that somehow the US loses its competitive edge?
So I don't know automatically if having regulation and building that structure of trust will lead to loss of competitive edge. I would go back to pretty much we have our financial institutions and our dollar have a lot of influence in the world because of our systems of trust. So I would not assume that. I also say that from the little survey that we've done recently, and report will come out about surveying people who are in charge of AI companies who are compliance professionals, that they're actually finding the uncertainty the biggest issue. They would love more clarity, no regulation, yes regulation. So I think the biggest thing maybe for them, as far as their innovation perspective, is to actually, decide something and move forward. I do think, though, that, excessive regulation, if it's too onerous, then what happens if people ignore it? So you almost want the amount of onerousness to be, proportional to the complexity and impact of the system. Because if it's, once again, I kind of talk about these middle level and small AI systems can still have a big impact, but they're going to be, so we don't want to necessarily ignore them. But they can't, they're often developed by small teams. There's no way they could do something very huge as far as a risk mitigation approach or a demonstration of trust. They probably just ignore it. Yeah, I think they would end up ignoring it, which is the thing we don't want. So we do need some scale for your size of your system, the complexity. And I think that's why I'm talking about each thing having little individual structures, right? We're going to want to treat kind of simple traditional machine learning different than generative systems, different than whatever we see for the general AI that comes out eventually.
That makes a lot of sense. I would just add, to me, when I think about this, yes, we want to be cautious about adding too much friction to the system, but there's a flip side to this too. I mean, by developing systems that users trust, you could also say this could actually improve or enhance competitiveness in some respects. So the last question, we've covered a lot of territory today. What are the research questions that you think really we need more focus on, more research, and not just within CSET? I'm talking about, we have a lot of people on this particular webinar, but just within the US writ large. What are those open research questions that you think are really important that we should be considering?
I would say I have 2. So that jump out. I think that we do not have a lot of the fundamental tools, academic, kind of like at the theory level, the math level, for how to assess and demonstrate trust for neural networks, for deep learning systems, which then are your generative AI. We need more effort on that. The other thing is as a tester, I like to say that we look at common expected operating conditions, how you perform there, how you perform at the boundaries, and how you perform at known issues and risk and vulnerabilities. And I think we do not know enough about the known issues. We're starting to gather issues that come publicly available in news reports. We're missing stuff that's discovered before release. I would love to see some way, we kind of have this academic research where people are kind of figuring out some risks and vulnerabilities, and we have post-deployment experiences of real life. But there's this place where there's, I'm sure, some risks, some vulnerabilities being learned out by the developer and the producer that we're not finding out. And I would love to figure out how we get that information, because that's critical for then one of those communal resources and sharing that and making safer AI.
And I think one of those communal resources is things like an AI incidents database, right? That we're trying to build and trying to understand and capture some of these pieces. That information sharing becomes critically important as we proceed into the future. Heather, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and all of those pieces. We greatly appreciate that. I'm going to turn it back over to Danny for any kind of last minute housekeeping things, but I really enjoyed the conversation today.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks, Heather and John. I'd like to thank Dr. Frase for a fascinating and timely presentation, along with John for moderating today's program. Thanks also to all of you for taking part in this discussion and for your many comments and questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. We'll be in touch soon with details on our next webinar, so be sure to watch your inbox. Until then, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.